Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Welcome to Strange Things, broadcasting from the Arkanasa Radio Studios in Laredo, Texas. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Tonight, we're going to be talking about something Unknown Gamer suggested I do. They said they wanted to hear about the Philadelphia experiment. Now, I've talked about this a few times on other shows, but I thought it was time to revisit the story once more. Way back when people were living in small communities, if your neighbors had something you wanted, you might get your friends together and march into their camp and take what you wanted. On the other hand, if your neighbors were coming in an unfriendly way, you would gather all your friends together and try and stop them. A battle was won by whichever side had the biggest and the baddest bunch of fighters. If the other side had the biggest warriors, you wanted to have the most on your side to stop them. Nathan Bedford Forrest said, "Get there first with the most." No one is sure when or where tactics came into play, but soon both sides were using ideas to win instead of brute force. We'll let the enemy march right into our land. As soon as they're in between those two big rocks, we'll drop boulders on them, or something like that. Another tactic was speed and violence of action. You tried to shock the enemy by suddenly attacking out of nowhere. It became common practice to train your fighters. Well, at least some of them. I won't get into all the major armies over the years, but the one army that always comes to mind is the Romans. Rome lived by the concept: if you wanted to live in peace, you had to prepare for war. An army could win a battle before the first soldiers met. The army was decorated in flashy, bright-colored uniforms. They had all kinds of banners and flags. They moved together as if all one creature. The enemy soldiers, looking out across the battlefield at what must have looked like one giant, unstoppable mass of death coming their way, might just decide it was better to run away than to try fighting. Armies began using things to soften up the enemy before actually fighting them. The Romans had something called a ballista that could hurl a spear hundreds of yards into the enemy line. This is where the word ballistics comes from. They also threw rocks using catapults. There were men trained to throw rocks using a sling. A sling could hurl a rock with enough force to kill a man at a long range. The projectile was just slightly less effective than a musket. Intimidation was a decisive force on the battlefield. People being people, war was also taken out to sea. Ships would be decorated with flashy images painted on their sails. The sides would be painted in intimidating colors, bright and colorful. You wanted the enemy to see you coming, so maybe they would surrender or run. George Patton said no war was ever won by dying for your country. The idea was to get the other guy to die for his. During many battles, men began using cover to fight from, hiding out in the trees and firing arrows or rifles at each other. Stealth became a common tactic. It is hard to find out who all came up with these ideas because history has so many accounts of war. Instead of a long, drawn-out history lesson, I'm just giving the basic overview. Colorful uniforms slowly were phased out. At the beginning of World War I, both sides thought the way to fight a war was to line up across the field, fire off a few rounds of ammo, and then run at each other. The soldiers were ordered to unload their weapons so they didn't accidentally shoot their own men running across the field. Well, somebody watching the other side running at them decided it would be a great time to simply keep shooting. Then, instead of standing there making a target out of your men, they were told to get down low and fire from the ground. This led to digging holes to fight from. Trenches began to form, and the next thing anyone knew, trench warfare was in full swing. This was not the first time men had fought from trenches. This was the first time stealth entered the picture. You knew the enemy was right there because you could see their defenses. Sandbags, barbed wire lined both sides of no man's land. All you had to do was watch the tops of the sandbags for somebody to stick their head up. The French came up with the idea of disguising things on their side of the battlefield. A camouflage for equipment and positions was extensively developed throughout the military by the French in 1915, soon followed by other World War I armies. In both World Wars, artists were recruited as camouflage officers. The idea was to make it hard, if not impossible, for the enemy to see your army. Both England and Germany relied on outside sources for food. Germany could get supplies shipped in over land, but still they used ships for a lot of their provisions. England, being an island, had to have just about everything delivered by cargo ship. Germany saw this as a way to win the war. Submarines were sent out to sink as many cargo ships as they could, thus making it impossible for England to fight. If citizens are all starving to death, they would put pressure on the government to sue for peace. Well, England began using convoys to get much-needed supplies across the ocean. A bunch of merchant ships would band together. A few warships would cruise the outer perimeter looking for enemy ships. This worked well up until the German submarines showed up. A sub could spot an enemy ship using a periscope, fire its torpedoes, and submerge before the warships could intercede. Sinking a ship using a torpedo was a bit complicated. First, you had to see the ship. Then you had to calculate how fast it was going and which direction. Then you had to know how far from the target you were and how fast the torpedo was able to go. There was lots of math. More torpedoes missed their targets than actually hit. Still, a lot of ships were being sunk, and this was costing lives and supplies. England wanted to make their ships invisible. Okay, that would have been a bit impossible, so they tried to make them very hard to see. All this didn't work either because a ship makes a very distinct silhouette against the sky. Since they couldn't make them blend into the surrounding ocean, England decided to make them confusing to be hit. The British began using something called dazzle. Ships were painted using stripes or zigzagging patterns. The entire length of the ship was covered in bizarre-looking patterns. This made it hard for submarines to determine the speed and the distance to the target. The hit rate of torpedoes went down considerably as a result of dazzle camouflage. Still, nobody was invisible yet. On November 11th, 1918, the war to end all wars came to a close. The Allies decided there was never going to be anything like that ever again. Germany was being forced to pay for the whole conflict. This drove the entire country into a horrendous depression. People would insist on being paid twice a day. As soon as they had their money, they spent it, because by nightfall the Deutschmark was going to be worth less than it was at noon. Germany spiraled down to about as low as they could get, and then Hitler came along and things really went south. Germany began to take over all of Europe. England found themselves all alone fighting to stay alive. Well, the United States was helping keeping England alive, but everything had to be shipped across the Atlantic. Germany was once more using submarines to sink merchant ships, only now they were doing a much better job of it. The United States began looking for a way to keep the enemy from sinking their ships. The dazzle camouflage only worked against World War I subs because their aiming relied a lot on guesswork combined with a lot more math complicated by physics and a lot of luck. World War II submarines were equipped with some advanced electronics that took all the guesswork out of the equation. The U.S. wanted to make a ship not just hard to see, but they wanted it to be invisible. The first idea was to disperse the sonar signal coming from a submarine by the U-boats couldn't get a fix on the convoy. They wanted to degauss ships by neutralizing their magnetic field by encircling them with a conductor carrying electric current. A sonar was an electric system for detecting any object under the water by emitting sound pulses and then detecting or measuring the return after being reflected. The U-boats were using sonar looking for underwater parts of the ships in a convoy. Once they made contact, they would motor over in the direction of the signal and then use the periscope to confirm their sighting. The United States got some of their biggest thinkers together to work on how to make a ship invisible to sonar. Nikola Tesla was one of these men, and Albert Einstein was another. Nikola Tesla accomplished more in his lifetime than many of us could ever hope to achieve in 1,000 years. Tesla held over 300 different patents, spanning several countries. Everything from wireless technology to alternating current, electric motors, radios, X-rays, radar, and laser technology, just to name a few. Albert Einstein had come up with the theory of relativity, the formula for the nuclear bomb, the concept of quantum mechanics, and he once said that time travel wasn't impossible. You just had to figure out how to get enough power. A little known thing about Einstein, he knew his autograph was worth money. Anytime he ate out, he would write a check for his meal. The person taking his check would never deposit it. The check would be squirreled away someplace safe. The money was always left in Einstein's account. He wasn't so good with his own income, though. He would receive a check from somebody and put it in a book as a bookmark and then never deposit it. Tesla was also horrible with money. He should have been a millionaire, but instead he died flat broke. The people that owed him money simply never paid. They all lived high on the hog and died with tons of cash. The Navy wanted results, and it wasn't a bad idea to get some before the other branches of the service came up with neat ideas. Let's face it, everybody wanted to win the war, but each branch wanted to be the deciding factor. I, of course, would have been rooting for the Army, but that's just me. The Navy got together as many scientists as they could, with the caveat that all of them had to be able to keep a secret. Tesla was a pacifist, but he also wanted to end the war with as few casualties on the U.S. side as possible. Making a ship hard to see so you can't sink it was a good way to end the war that was going on in Europe. Einstein had shown how gravity could be bent and it could cause light to move around a large object in his 1919 experiment, when during a total eclipse of the sun, a star that was on the far side of the sun could be visible, thus showing how light would bend due to gravity. Today, this is known as gravitational lensing. The hard part now was creating a gravitational field strong enough to bend light around a ship. To do this, you would need the best electronic scientists on Earth. Tesla and Einstein working together. What could possibly go wrong? The first experiments were conducted using small-scale models. The trouble is making the electric circuitry small enough to fit inside the models. They must have gotten something right because it was decided to step up to the next level. If you watch Mythbusters a lot, like I did, you would have seen Adam and Jamie would start out with a small-scale experiment and then they would gradually increase the size. The USS Eldridge DE-173 was a brand new destroyer escort. It was still being fitted, and this was the ship chosen to make invisible. It was a sound idea because a ship was saleable, yet it still had a lot of open spaces to install all the massive generators and cables needed to be worked. There wasn't any retrofitting needed. I recall one night while listening to Coast AM, some writer was telling Art Bell that the ship used in the Philadelphia experiment was actually a German vessel that was in the United States prior to the outbreak of war. The writer was adamant that the experiment took place in 1941 and not 43. His theory was that the Germans had invented the light-bending technology that the U.S. Navy was going to use. Had this been true, I don't think Hitler would have allowed such an advanced technology out of his tight fist. I tried searching through all the old Art Bell shows to find this one, but there are way too many. The Eldridge was 306 feet long from stem to stern. That would be from one end to the other. It was 36 feet across, and it sat 12 feet underwater. It had a crew of 216, 15 officers, and 201 enlisted. The entire complement would not be needed for the experiment. Too many men on board was too many men that might just see something that they shouldn't. Secrets are hard to keep, and during wartime, you had to take steps to keep the enemy in the dark. For such a mission, you'd need just enough men to get the ship out of its berth, hold it in place for a bit, and then back to the pier. The guys running the generators and the electronics would also need to be on board. Maybe 30 or 40 men. The insides of the ship were mostly empty of equipment. The ship was still under construction. There were electronics needed for the ship to perform its mission. Cables were run all around the deck of the ship and inside the hull. It might have been like wrapping a nail with wire and then hooking them to a battery. It would create a giant electric magnet. Not everybody would know what was going on. Need to know means you only knew what you needed to do your job. The guys running the engines didn't know what the deck crew were doing. The officers would only need to know what they had to tell their men to do. Wartime lives could be risked with far less trouble than during peacetime. The experiment was to take place in the harbor in Philadelphia. There would be a lot of people lined up along the decks of other ships. The Navy could order all personnel to go below decks. Sailors would comply. There were also lots of civilian workers all over the shipyard. And civilians don't necessarily follow orders like enlisted men. But really, what would they be able to say happened? A ship may or may not vanish while in the harbor. The important thing was nobody knew what was happening or how. The disappearing act was not secret. The mechanics of it were. In the first experiment of electrical field manipulation, allowed the U.S. Eldridge to be rendered invisible on July 22, 1943. Those able to watch said there was a greenish-colored fog that enveloped the entire ship. The fog slowly faded, and the ship was gone. This was probably one of those events where people would rub their eyes, wondering if they had just imagined seeing something. I thought there was a ship there, but I must be mistaken. The men on board the ship were running various experiments inside the experiment. The radio operator tried sending and receiving messages. He found his radio was all but useless. Only static filled the headset. The radar operator tried using his equipment as well, with no results. Men on deck tried to see the shipyard around them. All they could see was the green fog. To them, it never cleared up. The captain of the ship was given a time frame to halt the experiment. After the allotted time, the generators were shut down. After a few minutes, the Eldridge reappeared. The ship returned to the pier and the crew was interviewed. You folks never in the military might not know how this would feel. It's not like being asked a few questions. It was more like being told what you could say. Did you see anything? Did you talk to anyone? They would be asked a bunch of questions and then told to keep their mouths shut or face a court-martial. From what I could find, some of the crew reported feeling sick during and after the time the electric generators were switched on. Some still felt sick a few days later. This would go along with what ghost investigators will tell you about high EMF readings. After reviewing all the reports from the crew, it was discovered as long as the electric field was on, the ship was pretty much dead in the water. They couldn't maneuver, they couldn't see, and they couldn't communicate. Oh, this is what you do in a fight. You shoot, you move, and you communicate. At some point in the mission, Tesla became worried about trying to make a ship invisible. He was worried they were playing with forces beyond their ability to control. If you know anything about Tesla, he was not concerned with dangerous experiments. For him to back out means he had discovered or encountered something really outside his comfort zone. He may have left the team in 1942, but records are not that clear. I have found several that contradict each other. In 1943, the project was entrusted to Dr. von Neumann, headed by a team of doctors Gustav Clarkson, David Halbert, and Henry Levinson. Having an invisible ship is kind of useless if you can't use it. A convoy of invisible ships would become a catastrophe. The Navy told the scientists to rethink their mechanisms. The second experiment took place October 28, 1943. This time the ship was to use a different wavelength. Once more the ship was crewed by the least number of men needed. The Eldridge made its way to the center of the harbor. Once in place, the generators were turned on, and the ship disappeared from sight. Other small vessels stationed around the Eldridge noticed something was wrong. If the ship was just invisible, there should have been a ship-shaped hole in the water. Just being invisible didn't change its effect on the water that it sat in. A motor launch moved in close to where the Eldridge should be, and they tried to touch the side of the ship. They would move in closer and closer, holding out an oar, trying to touch the side of the ship. The motor launch passed right through the area the ship should have been in. Meanwhile, in Norfolk, Virginia, 250 miles to the south, crews of Navy ships and civilian personnel were all amazed to see a ship suddenly appear in the harbor. The men in the Navy all recognized it as being a destroyer escort. The ship sat there in the harbor as if it belonged there. Well, the folks in charge tried raising this mystery ship on the radio. A ship didn't just appear in the water near a Navy yard during a time of war without the people in charge knowing it was coming. Security was tight in every port in the world, especially the United States, who had just entered the war after the Pearl Harbor incident. As questions were being asked, only to go unanswered, the mystery ship vanished. A lot of men had seen the ship in the harbor. The harbor master needed to report this to Washington. He sent a telegram with the time, date, general description of the vessel, and what appeared to have happened. Somebody in Washington read the telegram, and they realized the time matched those of the experiment that was going on at the exact same moment. It didn't take much to decide that the U.S. Eldridge had done more than turn invisible. The first steps taken would be to tell everybody that might have seen something to not talk about it under the threat of being court-martialed as being a German spy. No one would have wanted this on their reputation. Just the possibility of people thinking you might be a spy could have devastating consequences. If you weren't a good, well-respected patriot, you were an enemy to everyone. Even if you never actually went before the brass, your life would be a shambles. The next step for the folks in charge would be to get with Einstein and Dr. Van Neumann and ask them if this might be some possibility of having actually happened. Only those at the very top of the team would be apprised of what was being said and what had actually happened. The Eldridge had managed to make it back to Philadelphia, but things were not good. It sat in the middle of the harbor, and the crew didn't respond to radio calls, so a detail was sent out to board the ship. And at that, I am going to take a break and play a few commercials and drink some coffee, so don't go away if you want to hear the rest of this exciting and mysterious story. You're listening to Arkanasa Radio. Did you hear a bump in the night and you think it just might be a ghost? Contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com. That's the LPRS for all your otherworldly needs. Coffee, nectar of the gods. And at the Organic Man Coffee Trike, you'll find coffee made the right way, one delicious cup at a time. Stop on by 4501 McPherson, Suite number 9. And remember, life is too short to drink bad coffee. Are you taking care of your skin? Or are you going to wait and see how time treats you? Take care today by contacting Lourdes James, Independent Beauty Consultant, at 956-723-3019. Don't let time get the best of you. Did you go out UFO hunting and couldn't focus on the sky? Swing on by Del Norte Optical, 107 Calle del Norte, right across from the Embassy Suites. That's not a weather balloon, that's a flying saucer. This is Arkanasa Radio you've been listening to. And welcome back to the show. Now, men who climbed the ladder to the deck of the Eldridge were in for a shock. Some of the men that had been stationed on the deck were now partially in the deck. Some were still alive, while others had died from having their internal organs interfered with by parts of the ship. The ship was towed back to the pier, and the entire vessel was put under tight security. Those able to be moved were taken to the secure hospital for examination. Those still stuck in the ship were either cut loose or left to die. Any dead sailors would have had their military records changed to show they had shipped out long before the experiment had taken place. They would have been added to the list of men lost to enemy attack. Records were changed. The ship's log of the Eldridge was changed so it would show the ship was in Florida instead of Philadelphia. There were no electronic records, it was all on paper. The ship itself was quickly stripped of all the electronic equipment that was used in the project. The ship was then placed into service and sent out to escort convoys to the Mediterranean. The experiment was then moved to a more secure location. More than likely, this would have been Montauk, New York. At the time, Montauk was an isolated location with the advantage of having access by sea. Just the kind of place the Navy would like. A lid was hammered shut on the entire Philadelphia experiment. In 1951, the Eldridge was transferred to the country of Greece. Greece christened the ship the H.S. Leon, using the vessel for joint U.S. operations during the Cold War. The U.S. Eldridge is supposed to have met with an unceremonious ending when it was dismantled and sold for scrap. In 1955, Morris K. Jessup, a professor of mathematics and physics, also an amateur astronomer, and the author of a book, The Case of UFOs, received a mysterious letter from a man going by the name of Carlos Allende. Carlos gave Jessup some details of the disappearance of the USS Eldridge and the strange symptoms and signs of the few of the survivors of the crew. Jessup was given the basic overview of the story, but the details were all missing. Well, intrigued, Jessup sent a letter back to the return address asking for more of the story. It had been 12 years since the experiment had been tried, and there was nothing Jessup could find on it. Allende told Jessup that he had been assigned to a cargo ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth. The SS stood for screw steamer, as opposed to, say, a side paddle wheeler, which would be an SW. Allende said he was on the deck of the Furuseth in 1943 when the Eldridge vanished. He stood there in amazement, wondering what he had just witnessed. The Eldridge popped back into view after being gone for a few minutes. Allende said he could see men on the deck as they tried to pull themselves from the steel superstructure they were now fused to. Being the curious type, Allende tried to find out what was going on without drawing too much attention to himself. He had been told by the Navy officers to keep his mouth shut about anything that had happened that day. After poking around in the shadows for a while, Allende was able to locate someone that told him about one of the survivors that had been sent home. The former sailor was sitting at the dining room table when he suddenly rose, grabbed his hat, and walked out of the room, going right through a solid wall. He was never seen by his family again. Another story Allende tracked down involved one of the surviving crew members from the Eldridge who had gotten into a fight in a bar. The sailor was in the process of adjusting a few attitudes, or maybe he was the recipient of the adjustments, when he suddenly vanished. The men he'd been pounding on all turned in every direction, thinking they were in the middle of some kind of a fight trick. The sailor was never seen again. Allende had attached several ambiguous articles to his letter about the experiment. These articles had appeared in the press over the years, but they didn't give too much of a conclusive idea of what the story was about. I tried to find copies of these articles, but without the dates and the names of the papers, it's hard to track anything down. There are some supposed copies on the internet, but their veracity is questionable. Carlos Allende was not his real name. The writer of the letters was actually named Carlos Allen. Try that again, Carl Allen. He was still concerned about the Navy tracking him down. This was causing him some difficulties, so he was using an alias. Carl was able to supply enough evidence to convince Jessup there was something to the story. After much back and forth correspondence, Carl said he was willing to undergo hypnosis as a way to prove he was telling the truth. As far as I can tell, there was never any hypnosis session. After several months, Jessup began to lose interest in Carl and the Philadelphia experiment story. 3 years later, 1958 or thereabouts, Jessup was called to the ONR, or Office of Navy Research, to make a statement about the book he had published years before. Intrigued, Jessup showed up at the ONR headquarters where, to his surprise, he was asked to explain handwritten notes in a copy of the Case for UFOs. A copy had been sent to the ONR office showing a return address that was the same as the letters Jessup had received several years ago. The notes were written by 3 different people. One was credited to Lord A, the second was Lord B, and the last was Jemmy, spelled J-E-M-I. Each was written using a different colored pen, and the punctuation marks were randomly scattered about without any apparent logic. Jessup recognized Lord A handwriting as being that of Carl Allen. The other notations all along the edges and the margins of the book were unknown to him. The notes went into some detail about anti-gravity propulsion, UFOs, aviation, and the bizarre events that had taken place at the Navy shipyard in Philadelphia back in 1943. There were also a few notations dealing with aliens from outer space being here on Earth. Jessup was unsure as to why the ONR was so interested in the notations in his book. They wanted to know everything he knew about Carl Allen and his letters to Jessup. The ONR said they had sent some investigators to the return address, only to find it was a long abandoned farmhouse. They said it looked as if nobody had lived there in years. During the interview with Jessup, he got the impression that the ONR was trying to make him believe Carl was some kind of a psychopathic madman. Jessup found this to be very strange, since they had called him to tell them about the notations in his book. On April 20th, 1959, Jessup was found dead in his own garage, asphyxiated with exhaust fumes. It looked as if he had committed suicide. Nobody that knew him thought he was the type. There had been no indication to anyone that Jessup was in any way suicidal. This brings to mind many other instances where people have been suicided to stop them from either looking into something or telling what they knew. People like James Forrestal, who was supposed to have jumped from the window of Bethesda Naval Hospital May 22, 1949. He was about to be released from care and his brother was picking him up. If you give his story the slightest look, you'll find way too many things that point to murder instead of suicide. Nikola Tesla, who had officially withdrawn from the project before the alleged Philadelphia experiment, claimed that his discoveries would be used to the detriment of humanity and not for their benefit. After this episode, Tesla was removed from the sphere of scientists in the government work, and he was classified as being a mad scientist. 1937, while out for a walk, Tesla was nearly killed by a hit-and-run driver. The vehicle fled the scene, and Tesla insisted on returning to his apartment. He was found dead in the hotel room where he lived. His entire archive, including studies, notes, and sketches of experiments, were all confiscated by the FBI under the Alien Property Act, which is odd since Tesla was a United States citizen, having been naturalized July 30th, 1891. The FBI would have known he was a U.S. citizen, so why did they confiscate all of his possessions? I'll bet there were records of the Philadelphia experiment in Tesla's records. Albert Einstein made a statement in an interview with American publications, said, "If I knew what my discoveries would do, I would have made myself a watchmaker." Carl Allen, a.k.a. Carlos Allende, stopped talking about what he'd seen in Philadelphia. He refused to be hypnotized and no longer would talk about invisibility or time travel. He died on March 5th, 1994, at the age of 68 in Centennial Healthcare Center, Greeley, Colorado. I used to listen to Coast AM all the time. Back in the 90s, if there was a show you really liked, you could buy a copy on cassette for $35. The recordings would be about 2.5 hours, so you'd have to get several cassettes. The art Then Art began putting his show on the web. So I began recording the show when it was digitally available on the computer. I would download the show onto CDs, and now I have stacks of CDs all over my office. Later, all of Art's past shows started showing up, and I made recordings as they came available. Stacks and stacks of those little round discs. Now I can record hundreds of hours worth of shows on an MP3 player. I still have the CD player in my truck. And I still have all those CDs everywhere. I even got to talk to Art Bell one night on his radio show, but that was a different subject. Back in June 20th, 1993, Art Bell interviewed a man named Al Bielek. You can find the show on YouTube. Here is the short version of the show. Al Bielek said the Philadelphia experiment actually started in 1931. Nikola Tesla, Dr. John Hutchison, not the guy in Canada, Dr. Emil Kuttnauer, and the University of Chicago had begun looking into making something invisible. After doing a feasibility study for 3 years, the research was moved to Princeton. This was when Albert Einstein and Dr. van Neumann got involved as well. In 1940, the invisibility was successfully tried at the Brooklyn Navy Yard. The ship they used was called a tender, a ship used to support other ships, which was hooked to 2 other ships by cables, one on either side. These ships had all the electronic equipment, so the test ship only had the magnetic coils on board. The test ship was unmanned during the experiment. Al Bielek was born in 1927. He said he was originally born as Edward Cameron in 1916. His father was Alexander Duncan Cameron, who was high up in the Navy, either a commodore or an admiral, some such. He ran around on all of his wives. Edward Cameron was Al's brother to a different mother, and he was born 7 months after Al. With no loyalty to his wives, Alexander did see to it that his sons both received a very good education. They both studied physics. The old man also insisted that they both join the Navy, so Al and his brother both went in 1940. The Navy was aware things were heating up around the world, and the 2 brothers were both given commissions as lieutenant junior grade. They were assigned to a ship at Pearl Harbor. December 1941, they were both fortunate that they were on leave. When Japan attacked Hawaii, the 2 Cameron brothers were reassigned to Project Invisibility. They were stationed at the Philadelphia shipyard, where they were to assist in making a battleship invisible. President Roosevelt said if they could make a battleship invisible, it would end the war. Nikola Tesla looked over the proposed experiment on the battleship, and he concluded it was going to be a disaster. The crew was going to be placed in extreme danger, and Tesla wanted nothing to do with the deaths of possibly the entire crew. So he fudged the settings on the machinery, and the test was a bust. Either the Navy found out about the fiddling Tesla did, or he simply wanted nothing to do with it. Either way, Tesla was off the project from then on. Van Neumann took over and immediately began switching from the battleship that was already in service to using a ship still under construction. He grabbed the first ship in dry dock, DE-173, which at the time had no name since it hadn't been christened yet. The ship being under construction was far easier to work on. There was no need to retrofit it to make the ship usable. The giant generators and other equipment could be placed in areas that would have been taken up by the crew's quarters or other places not yet put together. Van Neumann also increased all of Tesla's original settings for power and the frequency used on the ship. July 22nd, they tried the first test. It involved an all-volunteer crew consisting of 15 sailors and 6 officers. Al and his brother were 2 of the officers on board. When the power was turned on, the ship slowly faded from sight. The men assigned to witness the experiment noticed they could see a huge hole in the water where the ship used to be. A field was encircling the ship, making everything invisible. A crew in a motor launch tried to make contact with the ship, but they found they couldn't get through the invisible barrier. They figured the ship was still there, but suspended in air. This could lead to the ship breaking in half, so the men in charge said it was time to end the experiment. The trouble was, nobody could make contact with the ship through the invisibility field. After 20 minutes, Al and his brother began shutting down the power to bring the test to an end. Inside the ship, everything had looked normal. As the brothers exited their station, they found that sailors on deck were all suffering from nausea and vision trouble. Some had headaches and dizziness. These symptoms soon faded. A second test was quickly scheduled, which made Al and his brother a bit concerned. Why the big rush? Normally, tests like these were carefully examined and all aspects taken into consideration. The Navy was in a hurry to get on with it. During the second test, the ship went a bit hazy, and then it was gone. There wasn't even a hole in the water where the ship should have been sitting. For the next 4 hours, there was no evidence the DE-173 was still afloat. In the generator room, things were getting exciting. Smoke was building up to a point it was getting hard to breathe. There were sparks flying about, so Al and his brother tried shutting off the power. The switches were all frozen in place. They went up to the deck, needing air. There, they found the deck crew was all stumbling about as if in some kind of a daze. The smoke was billowing from the hold. It looked dangerous, so Al and his brother thought the best thing to do was to jump ship. They could swim for shore and let the experts figure out what to do. They both dove over the side and fell, and fell, and fell. There was no water. Instead, the 2 men suddenly found themselves standing on dry land in the middle of the night. Navy personnel came running over and took Al and Duncan into custody. They were escorted into an underground bunker, where they met a man who said he was Dr. Van Neumann, only he was much older than the man they'd just seen a few minutes ago. The doctor proceeded to try convincing the 2 that they had somehow traveled through time to 1983, and they were now at the Montauk, New York Navy Station, the home of Project Phoenix, which was the successor to Project Invisibility. Van Neumann told Al and Duncan they had been tracking the ship as it flew through time. The ship was encircled by a hyperspace bubble that was slowly building in size and would one day destroy the Earth. Al and his brother had to return to the ship and shut down the power, no matter what it took. If you saw the movie The Philadelphia Experiment, the one from 1984, starring Michael Perry, Nancy Allen, and Eric Christmas, Al said it was mostly accurate, except for the middle part. He said there was no romance involved. Well, him and his brother got sent back to 1943 to turn the power off. To do this, they had to destroy all the electronic equipment using axes. Once the field was winding down, Al and Duncan went up on deck where they found sailors embedded in the hull of the ship. One was their younger brother. He was dying as they stood there watching. Duncan couldn't stand the idea that him and Al had been a part of this, and he jumped over the rail once more. When the DE-173 reappeared in Philadelphia, the Navy tried to raise them by radio. When this didn't work, they sent a boarding crew to see what was going on. This was when they discovered sailors fused to the deck of the ship. Everyone who had been on deck was completely insane from the electromagnetic effects over the 4-hour or 41 years the ship had been away. Al Cameron was taken to see Van Neumann, where he told everything that had happened. Well, Van Neumann didn't believe the story, so it was arranged for Al to go forward once more and try to get proof of what he was saying. Apparently, the proof was accepted finally, and Al was then sent on other time travel missions. He said that after 1947, the folks running things who were not elected decided it was best if they controlled all information involved in both time travel and invisibility. They also found it was easy to go forward to see how things turned out, so they could change the present, but it was far more difficult to go back in time to change things then. As the experiment continued, it was moved to Montauk, New York, and the folks running things discovered all kinds of new uses for their machines. Time travel, mind control, creation of bizarre creatures. Al Cameron was finally sent into a life regression trip where he became Al Bielek, a much younger person, and his records were erased by the government. Now this does sound like a fanciful invention of a story. Then again, so does time travel or creatures from another world. I'm not about to tell you to believe me just because I believe this story. Do your own research. Punch in Al Bielek and Art Bell and listen to what he has to say. Make up your own mind. One thing that always gets to me is when it was time for the call-ins, somebody would always get on who thought the whole story was bunk. If they didn't believe this stuff, then why were they listening to Coast AM in the first place? For that matter, why do folks waste their time calling in just to make fools of themselves? Especially back when Art Bell was on. He would hang up on somebody he didn't like in a heartbeat. As for secret government projects, why else would they have Area 51 and keep it locked down tight even today? The government we elect is not the government that has all these secrets. No, these are the shadowy folks we never see or hear about until something like this comes along. Could the Philadelphia experiment have actually taken place? Maybe. Perhaps the details are fanciful, but the experiment itself could possibly have happened. Knowing how Einstein and Tesla both thought, anything was possible with those two involved. I hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, let your friends know what they're missing. If you don't like it, well, I'm sorry, but I do the best I can. Until next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight? night in the hanging tree.